There you go. Got it.
Do you have a notification that says Youri's recording the call?
Yes, it's up at the top. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, here it goes. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And on the program tonight, and on the program tonight in our special Pride episode, All Things Queer Liberation, we welcome back to the show Tim McCaskell, a longtime queer, gay liberationist, leftist activist. He was once a contributor and part of the editorial team of the once popular and sometimes controversial gay underground paper, the Body Politic. He was also a longtime education activist of the left, and he was also part of Canada's AIDS Action Now. Did I get that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. It was actually, it wasn't. It functioned as a Toronto group, but we had a national reach and an international reach, for that matter.
Fantastic, and yes, this was a fantastic. This is a fantastic queer-led community that trying to address the impact of the AIDS crisis, and he was also a founding member of Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, and he's the author of Race to Equity, Disrupting Educational Inequality, and the superb book I have of Tim, which is Queer Progress from Homophobia to Homonationalism, which is a fantastic read. I can't recommend enough that people get this book. And so we're going to be talking about Pride. We're going to be talking about the plight of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, and yes, so let's get underway. So first off, Tim, thank you so much for coming back on the program. Especially good morning, because it is morning right now in Ontario.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, always happy to be here, and good afternoon to you in Belgium, right?
Yes, and it's an honor to have you back. And yes, let's get into the questions I have prepared. So Tim.
Sure.
What is your overall feeling of the state of affairs for your people, the queer community, the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, and how do you explain the incredible, horrific backlash and heightened hostility, particularly to the trans community, which we see in the UK, the US, Australia, and Canada, but elsewhere too?
Yeah. I guess, first of all, I think we need to think about the notion of backlash, because it falls into that kind of physics metaphor of the pendulum that swings and, goes this way and then it goes that way, and you get progress and then you get backlash. I think it's much more complicated than that, that what we're seeing is a crisis in neoliberalism, a crisis which is economic in nature, which is ecological. It has to do with a climate crisis, an environmental crisis, a crisis of incredible inequality, reduction in services, reduction in standard of life for much of the population. All of those kinds of things produce anxieties at two different levels, I guess. Anxieties among the ruling class, because how the hell are we going to control this mess? That all of these variables are going all at once, and try to maintain a facade of democracy, right? Because, so there's this impulse to more authoritarian state control from the ruling classes. And then among the rest of us, especially kind of lower middle class, working class people, especially ones who had a certain amount of privilege in an old system, privilege having to do with race or having to do with gender or having to do with whatever, seeing their world falling apart. And there's this anxiety about what's going to happen to me and my family and my kids and my communities and all of this kind of stuff. Some of that is directed against quote unquote elites. It's kind of a vulgar class consciousness, right? But much of it is I guess I would say, channeled into horizontal kinds of anger. So it's like the black people that are taking over, or it's like the young people who are taking over, or the women taking over, or in this case the trans people that are taking over and screwing up everything. And kind of get back to the good old days when everything was fine. Now, the good old days weren't fine or better because of the racism and sexism and homophobia. They were somewhat better because of the redistributive nature of Keynesian economics and the fact that in the imperial centers, we were sucking up value from the rest of the world in a way that is now becoming a bit more difficult. But that understanding requires a kind of an analysis that goes way beyond the they must be doing it, right? So rather than thinking of it this as a backlash, I think we need to think of it as a crisis in the neoliberal capitalist system, and where people without any progressive leadership are focusing their anxieties, and where ruling class people are focusing those anxieties in order to be able to get themselves off the hook. Right? So we don't like this kind of the physics metaphor. No, it's not that. It's going on. There's a class component that society is becoming more difficult to manage, and that management is leading us into scapegoating of particular groups, but also a general swing to more authoritarian societies.
That's a very interesting response you've just given, because I think if we want to talk specifically about the new stage of transphobia, because as you mentioned, transphobia has always been there, queerphobia at large has always been there, and just because you have a Stonewall riots, and just because a government here repeals sodomy laws, or a government there passes marriage equality, that does not mean that heteronormativity has been dealt. In that respect, heteronormativity has been dealt a blow, but institutional heteronormativity still is there.
Yeah.
Because the new stage of transphobia, it really started in Britain, in the United Kingdom. My theory as to why as to why it started in Britain, and now it's now it's being elevated more in the US, Australia, Canada, and elsewhere. My theory is this, at least when it comes to the LGBTQ community in Britain, is that Brexit happened. The far right got what they wanted. The narrow left nationalists got what they wanted. The populists of the right and the left and everybody in between got what they wanted. So to quote some of the people of to quote some of the Brexiteers, we have finally been given our independence back from that colonial institution known as the European known as the European Union. And of course there was a humongous xenophobic campaign, and so there was a huge xenophobic campaign that came with that. Now that Brexit is done, the right-wingers and even those on the left that either played footsie with Brexit or did advocate Brexit because they felt that this was a great a great blow to neoliberalism, will have a new dawn of socialism and socialism movements. Now that you can't scapegoat the European Union, and you can't scapegoat EU migrants or EU migrants and whatnot. What are we going to do now? How are we going to unite everybody? And of course, the rights are the rights are very good at uniting everybody when it comes to hatred for the immigrants, hatred for the Negro, hatred for hatred for whomever. And I think for some reason, I think they've decided that, okay, let's go after let's go after the trans, let's go after the trans community. And that's that's my theory why, at least in Britain, the new stage of transphobia started. I'm curious your response on that before we get to before we get to my second my second official
Can you
question.
describe a bit more the state transphobia in Britain? Because I know about the state transphobia, say, in the United States. It's certainly building. In Canada, it hasn't taken on aspects of state transphobia. It is mostly kind of a populist kind of a transphobia, right? In the States, it has. Certainly, you've got DeSantis and everything going on in Florida, and all of these states passing.
Yeah. The fascist of Florida, as I call him.
What's happening? What's happening in Britain that you would describe as state transphobia?
Well, Scotland tried to amend their. If I understood correctly, they were going to amend their constitution, which which says that women are equal and so forth, and they were going to amend that to include trans people, specifically trans women, in that. And there was an unprecedented attack on it, and apparently the ruling SNP, the Scottish National Party, which would like to see Scotland become an independent country, and they're more on the soft center left of the spectrum. I consider them center left, whereas Labour, I always consider Labour to be a right wing, a right wing party, a dietary party, if you will. Now, apparently, all the political parties in Scotland, even though there was opposition in Scotland, we're fine passing, we're fine, amending this and including trans women into it. J.K. Rowley and the the transphobia lobby defeated it, and it was defeated despite all members of the Scottish Parliament in favor of it. The Tory government back in Westminster, with their allies, the Labour Party, basically stopped it right in its track. The SNP now is in complete political turmoil because Nicola Sturgeon resigned, claiming that she's exhausted and can't give her 100% to being First Minister of Scotland anymore. The person who almost who ran in the leadership ran as a socially conservative Scots woman. And and then those on the left, which we're going to talk about later, who were very happy that this was defeated, said that this is another example of wokeism gone mad, political correctness gone mad. In terms of the rest of the United Kingdom, I wouldn't say that that the Conservative government and their partners are tomorrow going to pass a law that says that all trans people need to be put into conversion therapy, or we don't recognize a trans woman as a woman, a trans man as a man, and they're not trying to, at least as far as I know, they're not trying to stop young children from wanting to transition. But you read the mostly far-right press. It could be the Daily Mail, the Express, the Telegraph, the Sun, and so forth have been publishing a lot of op-eds and whatnot, which marginalize trans people. Piers Morgan, who used to be the host of Good Morning Britain, now has his own show on some Murdoch outlets, and then this new right-wing channel called GB News. They've been, every now and then, they particularly are upset about, trans people, trans liberation, and so forth like that. So curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the right wing, sadly, they've always been better internationalists than the left. They learn from each other. They watch each other's tactics and what seems to work, and they experiment and they try. I mean, you could see, you were talking about Brexit, you could see kind of the American right-wingers in there pushing the Brexit the Brexit movement very early on. So I'm sure that seeing the success of people like DeSantis in the States in being able to produce kind of a moral panic around trans people and how successful that is in impelling him towards control of the state of Florida, but his presidential ambitions as well. I'm sure that people are thinking about, okay, let's see how that plays here. I guess my sense is that we see this as a result of two levels of anxieties. When the right wing takes this on, it's largely an opportunistic a movement here, right? They say, okay, this works. This is going to propel us to power. Like not all scapegoats work all the time, right? I mean, it would be anti-Semitism was very, very powerful in the 30s, probably less so today. I'm doing an article in a book on the rise of the right, and I was looking at the kind of homophobia that's being produced by the right wing in Canada now, and it's very interesting because the line isn't that gay people are this threat or LGBTQ people are this threat like it was back in the 80s. The line now is that radical activists have taken over the LGBT movement for their own purposes. And this is not about equality and anymore. It's about promoting adult lifestyles on children. So, I mean, that's actually quite different, right? Because what it says is LGBT, ordinary people are all right. The gay people are all right. It's these left-wing activists that control the movement, which are our enemies, and what they're doing to our children, right? So they kind of scurry around a charge of homophobia because they can say we're not homophobic. And I mean, the frightening thing is that several of their leaders, as you find in Europe as well, are queer, right? Or at least gay, lesbian, right? So they also have an interest in attempting to disrupt kind of an older leadership that has taken more progressive positions on a whole range of issues. So I've kind of lost the track of my thought there, but I think that the important thing is to recognize that this attack on trans people has a political motive, right? That this is a vehicle for achieving something else, and something else is something that ruling class circles wants, and that ordinary people can be corralled into because their anxieties make them want to look for some sort of change. And the fact that we don't have any kind of strong progressive or communist movements to channel that change in a much better direction means that they're really vulnerable to the kind of demagoguery that the right wing is producing.
Perfect segue to this question. Now, funny enough, in your brilliant book, actually, let me see if I even have it. Saved, because you said something quite interesting in your book. Actually, instead of trying to find a specific passage of the book, but if memory serves me well, there was a part of the book where when you came out of the closet and found your community, the LGBT community, or at least the L and the G.
Yeah.
Maybe not so much the B because there is some colorism that does exist amongst the queer community. But at least when you found your people, you actually expressed that you're actually not a huge fan of drag performances, of gay men dressing as women and doing drag performances. Can you talk a little bit about that before I ask this question about the hostility towards drag queen storytelling?
Right. Well, I mean, in those days, there was a very conscious move among the leadership of kind of gay liberation, gay meaning men at that point, that our movement was closely aligned with feminism. And there was a certain strong current in feminism that said that drag was ridiculing women, right? This is making fun of women. This was like exaggerating all of the stereotypes about women. And so the drag was seen as being kind of politically incorrect, right? And I think that part of
So in other words, they sort of charge drag performers as kind of like, the minstrel shows
yeah,
when white people would dress up as blackface,
yeah,
mocking yeah,
yeah,
mocking my people, black
yeah.
people.
That's a very good parallel. I mean, that was kind of the thinking behind it, right? Now, for better or for worse, I think that that kind of position has receded. And I have seen like some very clever, politically astute drag performances over the years, right? That I remember in at the AIDS conference in Mexico, there was like a group of drag queens in Mexico that was like had stronger politics than like most of the left, right? It was like really incisive anti-imperialist kinds of politics, right, and funny at the same time, right? So I mean, there is that background tension. I think that today drag has been kind of embraced as this cultural phenomenon within gay communities. I mean, if it's drag race this, drag race that, everybody should go with the drag race, right? And people look at the artistry involved and the costumes, and it's kind of like a kind of clowning thing almost, right? And some of it has some politics in it, and a lot of it doesn't have politics in it. So the pendulum has really, if I'm back to using those metaphors that I just denounced, the pendulum has swung on that, I think, right? So that drag has become kind of a stand-in for what gay culture means, and I think that I think that we need to recognize that drag is a kind of a cultural product of a community at a particular kind.
A subculture within a subculture.
It does require artistry and all of those kinds of things. That one can understand it as making fun of sexism more than making fun of women, right? So that I think that kind of original reaction that I experienced has gone away, and I think part of that was also it was kind of it was a homophobic aversion to drag as well, right? I mean, growing up in kind of a small town Ontario in the 50s and 60s, I mean, boys had to act like boys, right? And as soon as you began to act any way that wasn't kind of in the, within those narrow things, you were suddenly in trouble. And so then to see somebody dressing up like a woman, for me as a young gay kid, was like, oh my God, right? It kind of was very visceral. And I think that probably shaped my understanding of it as well. So I mean, a lot of things have gone on since those days in the early 80s. I mean, today we've got these kind of drag queen readings in libraries and things to kids, right? And I mean, I find it really interesting that the right attacks on this are so devoid of content. Like, no one can say the book that they read was sexually explicit and inappropriate for kids, or what they said was da 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 da. The accusation is this is grooming, which is like this kind of vacuous word. Like, what does that mean, right? That you think a grade 3 kid is going to go off with a drag queen or something? I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all, right? And these are also, they're taking place in schools and libraries. You couldn't think of a much safer environment. And I think for the kids, I mean, this is kind of like being visited by clowns, and this is like a famous, this is costume, and kids love the glitter and all of that kind of stuff. And that I think it has that. So I don't think it is kind of dangerous in any way for kids, but also I think on a certain level it tells some of those kids that, yeah, it's all right to dress up. It's all right not to stick to particular gender roles, things like that. And so that's why the right's attacks are so hysterical and so vacuous, because it's really hard to think that there's anything really bad going on there.
Well, that's a perfect segue to this second official question of mine, which is, are the protests against drag queens telling kids stories to little kids, do you think some of these performers have been too provocative, and their stories and some of their performances not appropriate for these kids under the age of 13? And if you do agree with that question / statement of mine, if so, how does one convey this to drag queens? Because a fan of the show sent me, an angry couple of messages, and she had shown me that some of the stories that the drag queens were sharing with little kids was, I would say PG-13 and PG-13 and rated R, and then some of the performances of the drag queens have been, okay, if you were to perform that to kids 16 and up, but not sort of like 12 and down, I can sort of see where where one could make that argument. I'm curious your response.
Yeah, I don't see. I haven't seen that, and it would seem to me that if stuff like that was going on, that's what the right wing would latch onto. That's what we'd be having quotes from those books. We'd be having videos of those performances. You don't see that. You get this vague accusation about grooming. So I don't know what your fan sent you, but largely, I have not attended any of the drag queen readings to little kids in schools. It's sort of like I'm not a little kid, right? But it seems to me that those kinds of things have been relatively innocuous. Now, if there are like one or two examples of things that aren't, this is probably going on hundreds of sites and hundreds of places, hundreds of times. So there can be certainly disagreements over what's appropriate. But if in general these things were being inappropriate for prepubescent children, I think we would have a lot of evidence of that, because these things are being watched very, very, very closely, and I haven't seen that kind of evidence. Right, I haven't seen any of that kind of stuff coming up.
At least not particularly in Canada, but even elsewhere when you're in touch with your LGBTQIA plus friends in whatever part of the world.
Yeah, no, nobody's. I mean, and once again, this would, if that was there, we would know about it, right? The right wing would not let us not know about it, right? I mean, how they zoom in and how everything is recorded these days, and there would be evidence. And if the right wing can't say anything more than these people are grooming children, it seems to me that evidence is seriously lacking.
Interesting. And it could be that that the one or two examples which the fan and others have sent me,
yeah.
It could be that there are one or two examples where it's like, okay, that's definitely rated PG-13 or rated R, but then it's up to the audience, or certainly the organizers, to say, okay, tone down that, or you have to get rid of that completely, because I don't want the National Post, Fox News, Breitbart, and so forth to be
back. Right, absolutely, right. And yeah,
but then that's a perfect segue to this question, which is, as someone who worked as an educator, and you were a leftist educator fighting the good fight, how can we overcome queerphobia, particularly transphobia, in the schools and the workplace? Do you have a response to trans skeptics? Because you can never, because sometimes we get in more trouble for calling out a racist, calling out a transphobe, calling out a sexist than the actual transphobe, sexist, and whatnot. So do you have a response to trans skeptics / transphobes who want to stop children as young as 5 or 13 or even 16 from transitioning, and others who say only when they're 18 can they take the treatment to transition, or the more extreme transphobes who want to put those aspiring trans youth and adults into conversion therapy until they renounce their desire, their desire to change.
I don't think there's any evidence that conversion therapy works any better for trans people than it does for gay people. It doesn't work very much for gay people, right? And those big organizations that used to do that have largely collapsed after their leadership said, this doesn't work, and I didn't change, and all of this kind of stuff, right? It was kind of a political and perhaps a financial bandwagon that they got on for a certain period of time. And there is a kind of what's the word? There's this notion that children, like little children, are being operated on and things like that. Which is not the case. What largely could be considered trans stuff among younger kids would maybe like dressing up in the clothing of a different gender, or acting in a way that does not fall within the parameters of a kind of a gender binary with particular kinds of sexist stereotypes around it. I mean, for really younger kids, probably the only kind of medical intervention may be puberty blockers at some point, where they try to figure things out. And like puberty blockers are used, they're used for children who have premature puberty, right? I mean, this is like, because that happens to kids too, right? There's like a medical condition. It even happens in terms of kids with what they call idiopathic stature problems. I mean, they're not haven't grown enough. And like once you start entering puberty, then those growth spurts tend to stop, right? And so they postpone puberty so that the kids can grow to the normal size, right? And then for kids that are experiencing, I hate to use the kind of medical term, but gender dysphoria, so that they get some time to begin to try to figure out before they enter puberty and all of those, those changes in physical changes that are involved in that, to try to figure out what, how they feel about themselves and how they want to live their lives. But this notion that there's this evil medical establishment that wants to operate on 5-year-olds, right? And once again,
and that's exactly what the trans skeptics and the transphobes are saying. That there's this huge evil big pharma industry that wants to just eliminate all of the genders because they're going to get all the money. And of course, in a place like Britain, which has privatized national health services, other places which have privatized their single payer systems or reformed it to accommodate capitalism, and a place like the U.S., I imagine that anyone who is who is transitioning, that is expensive. It does come out of like their pockets, and of course there are people who don't want transgenderism to be part of medical practice. Ergo, you have to go to the private world. So yeah.
So I think, there's another example of, I talked before about kind of a vulgar class consciousness. There is all sorts of reasons to be very skeptical of the pharmaceutical industry, right? And because they're there to accumulate capital, right? The production of particular kinds of drugs and things are like the use value of what they're producing is kind of secondary for them. And so they're driven by all sorts of motives that often are not in the best interests of people. Why it's taken so long to get proper treatments for things like malaria and tuberculosis and things like that has to do with who can pay for what, right? So, there's real problems there. But then to take that kind of insight and divert it into an attack on trans people and young trans people, that's the genius of the right? That they can begin to take that kind of real gut appreciation of like power above us doing stuff in their interest that's going to affect us poorly, and turn that into an attack on the trans person next door. Right? That's that horizontal contradiction is turned into that vertical contradiction is turned into a horizontal one. And I think that's what's going on. And if people like really understood, the kinds of medical interventions that are available to younger people, I mean, they're not, chopping people up. They're not castrating young boys and things like that. I mean, that's just not happening. At the most, you get these puberty blockers that give people a bit more time, of which which are completely reversible in terms, as soon as you stop taking them, it goes away, right?
But as somebody who worked to make education, education, for everybody, and not just and not just privileged people. But then how do you respond to concerned parents or trans skeptics and transphobes when they say children as young as 5 or 13 should not be even considering transition? They should not be given treatment to transition. If they're 18, though, okay, then they can do it. I mean, that's those are the people who sort of those are the people who sort of play footsie with transphobia, as opposed to the extreme transphobes who don't want who want to stop people from transitioning, or those who just want conversion therapy and lock the trans person in a mental institution until they renounce their identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you need to understand is that people look at specific kinds of cases, right? Individual cases. To say like 18 is somehow a magic cutoff point, that's the kind of law that you might need in order to be able to do general things like ability to drive or ability to vote and stuff like that. But we need to look at an individual case. If a young person has been on puberty blockers and they're 17 or something, and they've decided that the gender that they've been assigned at birth is not correct, then maybe it's time for them to begin to look at more medical interventions, right? But that's it's not like people are going in and getting an operation like that, right? I mean, it's not happening that way. And so many of the concerns, I think, of parents or of other people who are concerned about the welfare of children, and I think you need to look at that as kind of a non-antagonistic contradiction. It's going to be something that is not, you don't pass a rule, you don't designate people as transphobes or whatever, because then you'll just harden those kinds of divisions. What you need to do is to begin kind of the explanations of what's actually happening to individual people and how those decisions are made. And once people actually understand kind of the reality of a situation, I mean, I've always found that they're much less likely, or I mean, it calms down very, very, very quickly, right? It's the fact that this has been allowed to polarize in such a way that I think that is serving no one, and it means that the weakest party is always the one that's hurt most. And in those cases, it's the trans kids, or kids that are considering that. I mean, kids need time. I remember I used to run or co-run a kind of a support group for LGBT kids. In those days, it was basically LGB. At the Toronto board back in the early 90s, right? And there was this one young woman who joined the group at the beginning of the year, and she was there all the time. She participated, and it was very interesting. She'd be about 15 or 16, and at the end of that kind of year, she said, I've got an announcement to make. I really don't think I'm gay after all. It's been really good talking to you people and trying to figure this out and hearing, and comparing that to what I'm feeling and all this kind of stuff. But, this isn't me, right? And they're like, so she needed some time. This is a youth that's trying to figure stuff out in a world that has a gender binary that in fact really doesn't correspond to the real experiences of real people. I mean, if you go to other parts of the world, even like Thailand, for example, where you've got like a 5-gender system, right? With like all these different kind of options that people grow into, right? But here we've got
coming from Turtle Island,
yeah,
Two-Spirit
Two-Spirit, yeah,
people, and the whole concept of gender fluid, or even trying to even figure out what gender I really do identify with, or what's my sexual orientation. All that concept, which is why it's now to SLGBTQIA, emphasis on the Q, which queer, which is now just a huge broad term now. That comes from our Two-Spirit brothers and sisters and persons, because of course you also have to throw in the whole non-binaryism in that, right?
Yeah, so I think what we need to try to do is to not allow the right to polarize this for their own purposes in a way that's going to end up really hurting trans kids. And that the way to do that is to recognize this as a non-antagonistic contradiction necessarily, or that, like, for some people, this may be the hill that they want to die on, but for most people, it's not. And having done anti-homophobia education for years and years in the Board of Education, I found that people often just are listened to and have their concerns spoken to. Suddenly, they're not as evil and nasty and homophobic as they immediately present, but they've been kind of put into this kind of box, or that's where they come from, and nobody's ever actually talked to them. I don't know if I mentioned it on the last show, and it's not around the trans issue at all, but when we were doing the Queers Against Israeli Apartheid stuff, I got an email from somebody who said, I really don't understand how you can be against Israel when Israel is the only state in the Middle East that actually has gay rights, right? Now that is kind of like the standard Zionist line, right? And so it's like, okay, so, where you are, put you in a box. And so, but I responded and I said, well, these are the reasons, right? And I talked about the Nakba, and I talked about what's happened to people and the 2 laws and the travel restrictions and how it's similar to the apartheid system in South Africa and all of that stuff. And the guy wrote me back. I mean, I've never met him, right? And he said, thank you very much. I never understood that. So that's what you're talking about. That makes sense. Right?
Interesting.
But if I had responded with, well, you're just another one of these Zionists that are trying to, he would have never learned anything. Right. And so it's really important to engage with people. Now, some people, are the enemy. And yes, those are antagonistic contradictions. And you don't waste your time on people that, are not going to learn anything. But when you're looking at these kinds of moral panics that are orchestrated for political purposes, I think it's important to talk to panicking people and calm them down, right? Because panic is panic, right? And once you get into that panic, you're not thinking stuff, right? Thinking stuff through. And so take some time, answer some questions, right? Get involved in those kind of uncomfortable conversations, and you'll find that there's probably more middle ground than you could have ever expected.
That's fascinating, and yes, I'm duly noted. I will keep that. I will keep that advice in mind. Then I have to ask then this question, the 4th official question, which is, I sometimes don't have a response to people who are trans skeptic and and transphobic. I sometimes it is very deer in the headlights when I'm given an extreme example of such and such a thing, and so I often sometimes don't even know how to respond. Yeah. So, for example, I don't have a response as to what to do about bathroom issues, the changing rooms, or some of the constant transphobic tropes of those who aren't fully transitioned, who assault female prisoners. And I'm curious your response to that. How before I get to question number 5.
Yeah. So I think there's. First of all, it's a bit awkward for me as a cis man talking about trans politics in this kind of way, right? Because it's like, okay, there is a
I
relatively.
feel you. Hey, I feel you too. Sometimes, sorry to interrupt, but sometimes, sometimes, I just say, sometimes I just say to people, here's this book. Here's a couple of links of a fantastic trans Marxist, Laura Miles. Read her book. Here are some links for you.
Yeah.
Have fun. Have fun. Come back to me later about it. Because because I'm just an ally, and I'm just trying to be the best ally I can be to a marginalized group of people, which is the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, particularly the T. So, anywho, sorry for interrupting, but continue.
What I was going to say was just to recommend another book. There's a relatively new one. Pluto came out with it in 2021 called Transgender Marxism. Have you seen that one?
Nope, I haven't, but it'll be on my list of books to get.
Transgender Marxism. It's by let me see, Gleason and O'Rourke, and it's Pluto Press. Transgender Marxism. I got a copy. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but once again, as you're saying, like, I need to kind of read more of this and understand more of this as well. And I think people that are asking those questions need to be able to do that. And having a Marxist perspective on that, I think, is quite important. The washroom thing is like sort of back to what I was saying before about antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions. Women, cis women, are an oppressed group, right? And have as part of their struggle against oppression, fought for women's only spaces, right? Trans women are an oppressed group, right? And as an oppressed group, have fought for their right to be in the spaces of people of the gender of which they identify with, right? And so this is potentially a contradiction between two oppressed groups, and that falls under the category of a non-antagonistic contradiction, because what we're trying to do is to organize all of the oppressed groups in order to be able to begin to push against general oppression and in fact transform society, like move those oppressed groups who can be allies of working class people who have a kind of a direct stake in moving away from a capitalist system that exploits them, right? So, given that, how do you deal with that kind of a problem, right? And you need to be able to figure out that both sides of that argument have got arguments that are valid in terms of their experience and coincide with the kinds of political struggles that they have been engaged in. So, what do we need to do to get those two groups together and figure out? It's like, how do we deal with a really concrete thing like washrooms? And I mean, it is a concrete thing like washrooms. Like maybe it's several different kinds of washroom spaces. Some people say that all washrooms should be just gender neutral, but that really means that for women who don't want people who don't want bad actors. People like straight men do all sorts of weird things, saying, "Okay, I'm a girl now. I'm going to go to the girls' washroom and take a look." Right? I mean that can be a worry for cis women and trans women as well, right? And so simply having gender neutral washrooms also can produce different kinds of anxieties and feelings among different groups. And so this is like a practical problem. It's like a design problem. It's an architectural problem, right? That you need like designers and architects sit down with groups and figure out how can we organize these kinds of activities which are seen as being private and in which people are vulnerable and exposed. How can we organize this in a way that that nobody is being that is not accentuating the oppression of one group or another, accentuating the anxieties of one group or another, right?
A quick follow up. Do you think because we do want to see institutional heteronormativity vanquished from the face of the planet Earth, and if we do believe in queer liberation, which includes asexual people, which includes intersex people who will choose if they even want to, whatever medical procedure to align with whatever gender they they identify with. And then of course, the whole non-binaryism. Is the solution to it? Granted that trans skeptics even want this solution, that we do have gender neutral bathrooms or specific changing rooms and washrooms for trans people, but trans people if they've not fully transitioned yet, then
right. But once again, that's the practical problem that needs to be worked out with the people involved in the locations that we're actually talking about, right? And I don't have a kind of a standard answer for that, because the standard answers are theoretical; they're not practical, right? I mean, you know, the Marxist method is concrete study of concrete conditions. You look at what's on the ground, and your theory devolves out of that. As soon as you start to try to move from your theory and therefore decide what has to happen on the ground, that's ideological thinking, and that's not going to work, right? Because people's concrete experiences are always going to exceed the kind of abstract notions of theory. So that's why I'm saying that this is, I'm not trying to deduct the question, but this is a question that cis women and trans women and architects and designers need to actually talk through and think about, because there should be a way of accommodating the different needs of these communities, all of which are suffering from the kinds of oppression that a heterosexist society inflicts on everybody. And your screen has frozen. No, still frozen. Can you see me?
And you're also frozen right now. How about now?
Now
are we all good?
Okay, no, you come back now.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, okay. Now, one of the constant transphobic tropes, is which we often hear, is that there are trans people who have not fully transitioned, who assault other female prisoners. I'm curious your your response to that. And personally, a trans person, boy or girl or any age, I think they have much more to fear from cisgender conforming inmates, the guards and the cops and women in the guards and the cops and women in general who go to prison. The women who go to prison in general, it's a death sentence for them because the guards and the cops assault them. They experience more terror from the police, the army even. But if some trans person has committed violent crimes like Jeffrey Dahmer, I don't mean to sound sensitive, but so what? Like, what is it with non-trans and non-queer people and this model minority trans theory that all must be law-abiding? And if some do commit crimes, then we need to erase and eradicate an entire community. I'm curious, what's your response to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you don't even need leftist politics to begin to deal with that. I mean, that's just kind of very general notions of stereotyping, right? I mean, yes, is probably a black rapist somewhere, right? There is an example of all of the kinds of stereotypes about different groups. That doesn't mean that all black people are racist. It doesn't, all of that kind of stuff, right? So that's the kind of that's the kind of work that we would do around anti-racism stuff, multiculturalism stuff back in the 70s, right? So I don't think it should be all of that difficult to say that rather than having some sort of overarching theoretical policy about this and that and the other, you look at very concrete questions of safety for all concerned. If you're talking about prisons, for example, like where people are placed, right? And what kinds of conditions keep both inmates and their fellow inmates safe, right? And rather than coming up with some sort of very general rule, which maybe work in 90% of the cases, but not on the other 10, you look at the real stuff, like who is this person, right? What are their needs? Who will they be with? What are their needs? How do we begin to accommodate that? Once again, it almost becomes an architectural or a design question, right? When you take it down to that level. And prisons are, I mean, kind of the more standard line is that prisons are awful oppressive institutions, period, right? And we should be looking for alternatives to prisons, right? In general, right? Not just
exactly. That's my response. In fact, I'm currently reading this book, Invisible No More: Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, by the fantastic Andrea J. Ritchie. And it's very clear, despite some gains of trans people allowed to join the military, or some fragile gains that trans people have made, or even the entire LGBTQIA plus community has made, that that the police are institutionally not just racist, not just sexist, but very much institutionally heteronormative, and the kind of terror that that the author talks about trans people when they are swept up in the neo-Dickensian system is quite horrific. And so my response is, okay, well, if you're a police reformist, then we need to accommodate those non-gender conforming people, or those people who are in the process of transitioning. Put them in a special place. Once they fully transition, okay, you put them with the rest of the females and the rest of the males. But if you are really concerned about women's safety, I mean, dare I say, probably we should even abolish prisons. We should abolish the police because they are state terrorists. Because I'm just curious. Curious your response on that, because you are part of that movement that doesn't even want the cops to be joining pride parades and whatnot, right?
Yeah. And I think. No, as long as we are in a class society, there's going to be contradictions between different classes and groups of people, and that's going to. And capital has always used coercion, and so you can say we should abolish the police. I don't know how you achieve that without abolishing capitalism, for starts, right? And even when you do, kind of a socialist transformation, we understand takes time, right? All those contradictions don't just disappear. So what we need to, I think, aim at are ways of certainly reducing the power of the police, reducing their ability to coerce populations, because we know that coercion is not going to be evenly or equally distributed. It's going to be primarily targeting groups that are considered to be at the bottom of the barrel in terms of social hierarchies. But I think as well, we got to recognize that's a process that we need to begin to make steps on, right? And I think that the idea of like closing down all the prisons tomorrow, I don't think most abolitionists even mean that, right? But they're talking about engaging in this process that begin to shift the way that contradictions are dealt with, right? In the meantime, I think that we need to look at what we can do to minimize the amount of discomfort and oppression and danger that exists in these kinds of institutions until we can figure out a way of winding them down. And that, once again, becomes an individual decision looking at particular cases and particular kind of contexts.
Now, overall, do you think the largely straight left, the cisgender, gender-conforming left, has largely failed in being allies to the 2S LGBTQIA plus community in standing up to heteronormativity, from either recycling the transphobia industry's bigotry to the constant bitching about identity politics and queer people's plight is getting too much attention, to the fact that it seems to me one gets into more trouble for calling out a transphobe or queerphobe or other forms of bigotry, such as the constant such as the constant talk of too much wokeness, or trans and non-binary and others in the queer community. That is identity politics gone
Ah, whoops, we just lost you again.
Thoughts, your thoughts on that?
I missed the very last part. You froze for a bit.
Sorry about that. So, yeah, okay, so yeah, do you think that the straight left has largely failed in standing up to transphobia and heteronormativity from either, them recycling the transphobia industry's bigotry to the constant bitching about identity politics, or the argument that the mostly straight left says, which is too much attention is given to transphobia, to queerphobia, and that even the whole concept of of transgenderism and non-binary, that's just identity politics gone insane. That's too much wokeness. I'm curious your response to that.
Maybe you're drawing from European experience. I mean, the problem here is there isn't really much of the straight left, right, that's doing anything, right? You've got social democrats, right, that are generally fairly liberal on these issues, and are a bit of support. I was thinking at the Alternative Pride last weekend. You have your requisite couple of Trotskyist groups that show up with their banner in support, right, of kind of an anti-corporate abolitionist, anti-fascist pride. I don't, maybe I don't move in those circles, but really in the 70s, certainly there was a relatively strong left. And by left, I probably would say, the Trotskyists, the anarchists, and kind of the Marxist-Leninists, that kind of range of thought, and then the divisions between different flavors of each, right? And there was that kind of a debate about whether this is a distraction, and there was a whole notion of queerness being bourgeois decadence, right? That was going to disappear after the revolution, right? That kind of stuff. I don't hear that much anymore because I don't. The left is so bloody weak in Canada, or that kind of beyond the social democratic left, that there aren't a lot of conversations that are even happening, I don't think, right?
Interesting.
I do notice, like, every now and then a group pops up that that I haven't seen for a while, or that has been clearly under the radar, that's some sort of thing, and usually they at least do some kind of genuflecting to gay liberation and queer people, whether they recognize that as kind of a democratic struggle or a proto-revolutionary struggle or whatever, depending on how they kind of see the world. Those kinds of differences, but kind of a real rigorous debate about these questions on the left, it just doesn't really happen very much in Canada anymore. Or maybe I'm outside those circles. In the 70s, I was part of the thing called the Marxist Institute, and it was kind of a non-sectarian place. We offered different kind of courses on different aspects, different kind of social questions, and did courses in reading Capital and all of those kinds of things. And when that organization ran socials, all of the representatives of pretty well all of the leftist groups, people who would be like screaming at each other at the opposite ends of demonstrations, would be there, and it would produce these incredible discussions. I remember just being like fascinated because people would be going at it, but like this position versus that position and why this was wrong, and that was like, it was really fruitful and lively and important, I think, in terms of everybody's political development, not even to mention their debating skills, right, which are two different things sometimes. But I don't see that happening anywhere anymore.
So at least in Canada,
yeah.
Maybe so at least in Canada, maybe it's different in the U.S., Australia, or the UK, which I which is next door to Belgium. So I often do observe what's going on there. So at least present day Canada, you would say that the straight left has has largely done a fairly okay job of knowing how to chew gum and walk at the same time when it comes to fighting the class struggle and not throwing the 2S LGBTQIA plus community under the bus.
Yeah, I think that would be fair, or certainly say that they have come a long way in the last 30 or 40 years from when we started. That there was kind of blank incomprehension and hostility, and that I don't find anymore.
Interesting. Well, it's good to know that there is some optimism. Good thing to know there is some that there is some stuff that we can be celebrating. Then I have to ask this. My second to last question. Then I have to ask this, which is, how does the queer community advance itself, especially the T or the I's? How does it advance itself, and or do you think this is where the queer community itself, or do you think that the queer community itself, this is what the queer community should do, that it needs to continue carving out its own space? Parents of queer children or teens would be better off homeschooling in order to avoid the constant queerphobia and heteronormative attitudes that is rampant in mainstream public/private education K-12. Because I know a dear friend of mine was talking to me saying that I'm gonna try to hide their identity, but they were saying to me that that they don't believe anymore in the education system. They think that this capitalist system is getting more and more rotten. So if they have children, they want to bring them up in they want to bring them up in homeschool. And the person was saying to me that if my child comes out as one of those queer identities, I would want to protect that child from the constant bullying that goes on, the everyday queerphobia, or the institutional heteronormativities that's in mainstream public to private education. I'm curious your response on that. Again, given your background as as somebody who worked to make education fair and a safe space for all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of homeschooling. And I would say there's that old African proverb about it taking a village to raise a child. And homeschooling pulls people away from the village, right? You're there with your parents, right? For better or for worse, right? And sometimes parents can be just as bullying and homophobic and all of those kinds of things as a school system. In Toronto, we set up in '95 a thing called the Triangle Program. The Triangle Program is a place for LGBTQ questioning, two-spirit, the whole gamut, kids that, in fact, are not functioning in the mainstream school system, can go to find a supportive environment, a kind of a queer majority environment. And that, I was at actually the graduation this year's a couple of weeks ago. And I remember kind of thinking about these kids, who were graduating, getting their high school certificate, and thinking, boy, they would probably not survive in mainstream school, a lot of them, right? Now, Triangle has about 30, 35 kids in it, right? And this is from a system that includes 100,000 students. The vast majority of LGBTQ two-spirited kids probably do survive and cope with and challenge and fight back and change the atmosphere in the mainstream schools. And, they're fine there and they're graduating there. If for particular reasons and particular individuals or particular schools they're not, then they've got this option to go to. So it's an environment where they're going to get support, but it's not pulling them out of the entire community so that they're locked within the kind of confines of a nuclear family somewhere who probably don't understand their issues any more than anybody else, right? And so, again, I think rather than looking at kind of the general, or if you look at the general is that people need different kinds of options because people are really, really different. Some kids thrive in the mainstream schools. Some kids decide they don't want to come out in the mainstream schools, and that can be hard for them. But they think that because of what they want, that's their best choice. And I think we need to leave those choices up to kids. I mean, if some kids want to be homeschooled, then that's fine too. I think the COVID epidemic and kids being trapped in their homes, or like enforced homeschooling for almost the entire population for, almost 2 years. I think that almost all educational experts agree that's been a pretty bad experience for kids. I mean, kids are coming in who are frightened and anxious and who haven't developed social skills and just like having a hard time coping with kind of a world, a society that they have to live in. You can't live your entire life in a tiny bubble. So having those kinds of options for kids. I mean, the Toronto District School Board also. I mean, your friend is right. The school system is really fucked, and it's getting worse. And it's being, certainly in Ontario, slowly being strangled by the provincial government, which is, of course, trying to squeeze more middle class and affluent people out of the public school system into private schools, right? Because then they're off the government register, and don't have to worry about them anymore. They don't have unionized staff most of the time, whereas the school boards have unionized staff. So I agree with that, but I think that what we need to do is fight to maintain the system that we have and make it work. So the alternative, what I was saying was the Toronto District School Board also has a whole series of alternative schools that are more or less queer friendly. And often I can remember kids from Triangle, because you need a certain amount of credits to graduate, and say they wanted science credits, but Triangle's a school of 35 people. You can't offer the 100 different kinds of credits that mainstream schools did. And so many of them would get all their credits that they could in Triangle, get themselves back on their feet, right? Develop a sense of entitlement and pride and, who they are through that, in that kind of more cosseted environment. And then they would go out, sometimes to the alternative schools, which were kind of more gay friendly because they tended to be smaller and more hippy dippy and all those kinds of things, right? Or sometimes to the mainstream schools, and really, like, I can remember kids that left Triangle and went in and started organizing, queer groups in mainstream schools that have been tremendously homophobic, and, begin to actually change the atmosphere there, right? So my sense of it is that the public school system is being damaged, certainly. But what we need to do is make sure that there are as many options to fit the many needs that many different kids have within that system, and also fight to maintain that system's viability in terms of its public funding, so that we don't get a situation like we do in the States, where the public schools are slowly suffocating, and everybody's going to have to go private because, if you want your kid to get an education, that's what you have to do.
And of course, we have to fight to make sure that public schools are in fact either dirt cheap or simply open to people of all social classes, regardless. So that's definitely a subject I would definitely love to talk to you about in the future, which is education, whatnot. But it seems to me as long as we have heteronormativity, as long as that exists, there's always going to be queer only spaces or community centers which which are built by the queer community itself and their allies, whatever local politician is an ally to the community. So as long as heteronormativity exists, you're always going to have, though, these these support places or these alternative places to help out those who are being marginalized and whatnot, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a black-focused school, an Afrocentric curriculum in the Toronto board as well, right? Now, not all the black kids in Toronto go to that school, right? Need to, want to, whatever, right? Some do, and that's an option for them, right? And others are, fighting racism in the schools, the mainstream schools that they have, because we live in a racist system, and the racism is always going to be there. So having those options and being aware that those options are not, there's something complementary in the system. They're not an alternative to the system. I mean, maybe for certain individuals, but the fact that you've got the triangle program doesn't mean you can forget about dealing with homophobia, heterosexism, heteronormativity in the mainstream schools. Not at all, right? The fact that you need that kind of a system shows how much you need to do that kind of work in the mainstream schools. So the two things are kind of complementary. I mean, there's this notion like there was opposition to both the Afrocentric school and the Triangle on the grounds that it was going to get the system off the hook, right? That that they just send all those kids there, and what we have to do is like get rid of all racism in the schools, get rid of all homophobia in the mainstream schools. I mean, that's a great goal. Are you going to do that in the next 4 years? Well, this kid is in school. Are you going to sacrifice this kid's education to that long-term goal? Well, that's a long-term goal. You need something for this kid right now, and you need to keep working on changing the whole system, because you can't do one or the other, right?
Fascinating and fascinating. And then my final question is, do you have a seeing as it's Pride Month, Pride period, and my final question is, do you have a message you want to give to those in your community who feel despondent, demoralized, and deeply discouraged about the present and future, and a message to my people, the straight leftists and libertarians, libertarians who are socially liberal and tolerant? What can we do to be better and more effective allies to your people, the 2S LGBTQIA plus community?
Well, and maybe we should start talking about communities too, right? Because all of those, there's as many contradictions within that ever-expanding acronym as there are outside of it, right? I mean, in a certain way, I think if you don't feel anxious and despondent and worried, you haven't been paying attention. Like, there's really bad shit coming down the tubes, right? Everywhere. And so I think that what we all need to do, what the left needs to do, is to get its fucking act together before it's too late, right? I turned on Netflix last night and stumbled across this movie called El Dorado. And it's about gay communities in Germany in the 20s and 30s. And the essay, which is run by Rome, who is like pretty openly queer, right? Nazi, right? And the contradictions in that community, and kind of like, the vibrancy of that community throughout the 20s and right up until 33, and then like bang, right? Suddenly it's, I mean, they show this it's named after this bar called the El Dorado. And in 1933, suddenly it becomes a Nazi headquarters. Like it's no longer a gay bar, right? No longer a queer bar. And then it finishes off by looking at people as they try to escape or are murdered in the camps, like 2 or 3 different characters. The crisis that we faced in the 80s, which was basically that produced that wave of homophobia of the 80s, which is basically the crisis of the transition from Keynesianism to neoliberalism. They got neoliberalism and it was kind of resolved, and so things kind of, they didn't need the scapegoat so badly anymore, right? They didn't need the crazy Christian fundamentalists anymore. Neoliberal capital didn't need them anymore, right? Kind of like, okay, yeah, you're becoming embarrassing, guys. Just like, these queer people are more important to us as a market than as a scapegoat. And suddenly we became a market, right? And we can talk about
what's rainbow capitalism or rainbow capitalism.
What's the difference between the social organization of a market and the social organization of a community, right? Different kinds of things. So it's like, let's start to really think about getting prepared for the worst. What do we need to do to survive? What do we need to do to try to stop it? And since this crisis now isn't just a kind of a how to manage capitalism crisis, but it's an ecological crisis. It's a crisis of like huge inequalities. It's a refugee crisis of what, 100 million people. And there are more refugees in the world than, there's twice as many refugees in the world than there are people in Canada right now, right? You know, this is a crisis on so many levels. And we're kind of the canaries in the coal mine. We're the ones that are being attacked first, or trans people are the ones that are being attacked first. You know, gay people, as long as we are not too lefty, are supposedly part of the part of proper society now. Like, what do we need to do? Like, really seriously, what kind of organization do we need to have in place? What kind of organizations do we need to have in place? What kind of alliances do we need to make? Because if we don't get that organized for ourselves, you know, it's not just us, it's the whole world is going to be in deep, deep doodah, right? I mean, really bad.
Yeah, and you know, I mean,
that's not, you know, what. That's not perhaps kind of the most uplifting closing message, but it's like, you know, the best I got, right?
Well, I mean, but you know, I'll just say, you know, the following, you know, as well, one of the reasons, you know, why I am, you know, so passionate and devoted to queer liberation, you know, as a straight person is for me, it's just like, you know, what kind of leftist would I be if I support NATO? What kind of leftist would I be if I play footsie with xenophobia because I'm propagated about, you know, the evil Chinese state and all these, you know, yellow peril bullshit arguments? What kind of a leftist, what kind of an anti-imperialist leftist would I be if I start saying, yeah, NATO's a force for good in the world. Yes, I support the pivot to Asia. What kind of a leftist would I be if I don't believe in solidarity and you know, and trying to be at the front lines, or at least trying, you know, as best as I can to talk about the plight of Indigenous people, Latinx people, and hoping that people, you know, that those two groups of people build solidarity, because there's nothing better than solidarity, coalition building, because that's the only way we're going to, you know, eradicate white supremacy, the patriarchy, and heteronormativity, and I mean, you know, I think, you know, in the future there are still some talk, you know, about transphobia that we have to address, but we'll leave it for another time. But before I close, any other messages though that you want to say to the to the straight left, to those who are, you know, a bit on the fence about you know?
Well, I guess to the straight left, like, where are you in general, and how do we get out of this impasse? Why is it that the kinds of anxieties and dissatisfactions with elites that we are seeing being co-opted by the far right, why aren't we at the head of those movements? Like, why aren't we doing something with those real concerns and real anxieties that will help change the world and not destroy it? Right? I guess that's my question.
Well, as you said, the left in general, the straight left, get your shit together. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1, our all things queer liberation, with Tim McCaskell. Let me And Tim, I really have to get your book on on education. And so let me read out that that title.
Called Race to Equity.
Got it here. Got it here. We were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Tim McCaskell, fantastic queer liberationist activist, and yes, and folks do need to get his book, Race to Equity, Disrupting Educational Inequality. And I want to suggest that people get this superb book, also by Tim, Queer Progress from Homophobia to Homonationalism. It is a fantastic book. And to the trans skeptic and the trans phobes that do exist on the left, and and to the TERFs, I can't recommend enough Laura Miles, who is who's a socialist Marxist, gets her book Transgender Resistance: Socialism and the Fight for Trans Liberation. It is the must-get book for those who are not part of the community and those who do harbor transphobic views and heteronormative views. And Tim, what was that other book that you were recommending about trans?
Transgender Marxism by Gleason and O'Rourke. It's Pluto Press, 2021.
And another fantastic book. I would say it's queer. It's Queer Liberation 101, Anti-Heteronormativity 101 is this fantastic book, Seeing Gender by Iris Gottlieb, an illustrated guide to identity and expression. It's also a fantastic book. And in the end of the day, to those who are, to those who final message I have to make is to those who are, who do harbor heteronormative views, particularly, anti-trans views. I would also just, recommend them. I would say to them, you don't have to get it. It's okay. You don't have to get it. You don't have to get asexuality. You don't have to get non-binaryism. The only thing that community and allies of that community are asking is just be on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed. Do not play footsie and be on the side of the heteronormative right-wing dingbats and the liberal homophobes, and certainly, yes to queer liberation, no to rainbow capitalism, power to the people, death to heteronormativity, and all of the other evils. So, Tim, thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to having you back on the program, and and do enjoy the rest of Pride.
Okay.
I got all my flags here and whatnot. So, and best of luck to keep doing the great work you do and being an elder and an educator to all of us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great. Always good to be with you.